Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Soul Creativity. Thanks for joining us today. I'm very excited because we have two guests today, and our topic is peace. So, very important, very timely. We have timed this to be here shortly before International Day of Peace, which is next Wednesday, 9/21. So, please, after listening, if you're listening live or listening later, share the video and like and subscribe if you haven't yet. So, I want to welcome my two guests, Rivera Sun and Laurie Marshall. Both have been wonderful guests before on the show. Laurie was in episode 34, and Rivera was our last episode because we've been off for a few weeks, and that was episode number 39. So you can always go back and watch them separately. So welcome, Laurie. Welcome, Rivera. Thank you for joining me again.
It's great to be here. Thanks for hosting these wonderful conversations.
So we want to start right into talking about peace. The live chat is up, so if you're joining us live, please feel free to post a comment. And I always remind everyone, if you're not joining us live and you catch this later, but want to ask my guest a question, Laurie or Rivera, please post it and I'll make sure they get to it. So Rivera, I wanted to start with you, and I wanted to ask you, first, I'm going to have both you and Laurie, when you talk, address cultivating inner peace, as well as, taking it out to the big stage. But I wanted to ask you about peace being the presence of many things, not merely just the absence of, say, war or violence. So if you can start there, and then we'll have Laurie chime in as well.
Sure. Well, I think, peace is one of those words that sort of floats around. We all think we like it, right? It's like a good idea. Peace is a wonderful notion. But peace is more than just the absence of violence in our community, and it's more than just the cessation of war. Dr. King often talked about positive and negative peace. And a positive peace is a peace rooted in justice, right? So it's not just peaceful on the surface of things. It's peaceful because everybody has enough to live on. People are taken care of. Their rights and their dignity as human beings are respected. But a negative peace is when everything seems very peaceful on the surface, but underneath that nice, tidy little surface, there are things like racism, sexism, hate crimes going on in the shadows, people being horrible to each other, bullying going on at school is maybe a good example of that. So when we're thinking about peace, what we really want to be striving for is a peace rooted in justice. And so not just the absence of violence because, say, there's an authoritarian dictator like clamping down on everybody, but the presence of respect, dignity, human rights, equality, justice, freedom, responsibility, care for one another and our communities, protection of the environment. All of these things to me are part of what makes a positive peace. So that's what I think about when I think about that big word, peace.
And what about cultivating inner peace in regards to what you were saying? If we look at the bigger picture, but how do we balance that with our own inner being?
Yeah, it's very easy to get so caught up in trying to end all the injustices in the world that you start becoming a basket case, start running from one crisis to the next, or your mind is whirring so fast, it's like you're running in place mentally like that. And that can be really stressful on your body, and it can actually make you not that great of an activist, honestly. And so a gift we can give ourselves are practices that help us cultivate our own inner peace. And that's going to be different for each one of us. But I know for me, one of the things I like to do is to meditate, to, sit quietly for a few minutes and just try to let my thoughts calm themselves. right? And I might do this before a call like this. I might do it when I can't fall asleep at night because I'm too busy thinking about all the things I'm trying to do. Um, to me, that's a practice that I try to cultivate like a muscle, right? So I'm trying to get my muscle strong enough that I can interrupt the cycle of the inner agitation and lack of inner peace that I can cultivate in myself. So that's one of the things that I think about.
Thank you. Both of those things that you addressed, you just spoke so well about them. And I love what you said about peace and the really big picture of it, talking about justice and everyone being cared for. And that's so important. And oftentimes that is left out of the topic when we're, talking about peace. So I really appreciate that you mentioned all of those things. Laurie, I know that you talk about the power of the village as a resource in preventing war and violence. And I think that's so important because we have to look for what resources we can pull from and what we have available to us. So I'm wondering if you can speak about that and also your thoughts on cultivating inner peace as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I love what you said, Rivera. It's very important. It's important to put humanity in the historical context and biological context of the fact that for over 250,000 years, we only knew 170 people. That's how many people we ran into in our lives. And those people sang together and danced together and shared food and painted and told stories and wore clothes that were beautifully made and had symbols on them and took care of the children and took care of the elders. That's very deep in who human beings are. Also, that came with that there were two forces of stranger danger. If you weren't in my tribe, I was afraid of you. And also curiosity, because humans have always had curiosity. So we have some deep wiring for stranger danger because we never knew anybody but our own tribe for a very long time. And now we're aware of over 8 billion people from hundreds of thousands of tribes, which is very exciting because we can be nourished and learn from those tribes. But it can be very threatening if you have the paradigm that only one tribe is good. And we also have wiring to instantly make up stories. And one of our favorite stories is Good Guy, Bad Guy. And we get a dopamine hit from making up these stories. And if we have a very small story about who's fits in the tribe, then we get racism. If we have a big story that every human being fits in the tribe, then we have so much fun, so much more fun. And we now are watching people dance and watching people sing and eating frozen foods, and we're not singing together and dancing together and making art together and eating together and taking care of the children and elders. It's all farmed out and far away, and the children are segregated and the elders are segregated, and it's very hard on us. So I think knitting community where we are is very important. And I'm so excited about this International Day of Peace because I'm now in El Paso, where my grandchildren are. And a huge community is coming together to sing and dance and eat and paint and tell stories. And we need that fabric of peace building. And the practices for inner peace are challenging because 80% of all self-talk in most human beings is negative. That helped us survive, but it doesn't help us survive now. So the practice of converting negative self-talk into positive self-talk is something I'm still working on. And I, in addition to meditating, I also use art as a tool for my inner peace because I can release frustration. I can know what I'm feeling and see it. I can share what I'm feeling, and I slow down when I make art. So that's another one of my practices. So focusing on positive self-talk and breathing and drawing and painting.
Beautifully said as well, Laurie. I love the idea of the village and people. Rivera was just talking, about taking care of one another, and that hands-on, uh, being there, being present is so important. And as we know, loneliness is such a complaint for people today.
Yes.
And, I think there are varied reasons for that. But, some of it can be when we interact to take care of one another, that really helps to ease the loneliness. And you may not always be able to get together. It doesn't mean that you have to be physically present, in the same room, but there are other ways to handle that. And I also wanted to add, for cultivating peace, one of the things that helps me, and it's kind of tricky because, as we were just talking about with Rivera, if you pull yourself in too many directions or you're trying to do too much, and then you get over anxious because, you might not see results immediately, but sometimes being active, like going out and doing something, even if it's something small in your community, that can help ease too. That could be a form of self-care and also
Yes.
help to ease some of that, and cultivate peace. I know I always feel better when, even if I'm in the grocery store and I smile at someone or just talk to someone for a minute, in a friendly in a friendly manner, and we have an exchange, that can leave me feeling good for the rest of the day. So,
I
I
think
think
you bring,
action.
yeah, I think you bring up a really important point about peace as well, which is having purpose is extremely important to building peace. And the people that come back from the army whose lives were on the line, and they were so bonded with each other, and they don't have that extreme purpose, find it really tough. And the people that are rioting at the Capitol, they had purpose, right? They saw themselves as heroes. So we're built to have purpose. And if the cultivation of peace can be more widely spread as an exciting purpose, which I think Rivera's books do. Rivera's Ariara series and the Dandelion Insurrections are an incredible description of how purposeful peace can be. And we don't have a lot of those stories.
Exactly. And Rivera, I wanted to ask you, because this goes along with what Laurie was just saying about the culture and the difference between the culture of violence and the culture of peace, and what goes into that. I think you've said before, it's a very different looking world when we're in a culture of peace. And so I was wondering if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think sometimes we need to sit down and look around at our world and say, what is the purpose of the systems and structures that make up our world? Like, fundamentally, what is the purpose of a mega corporation, right? Is it the peace and prosperity of all, or is it the profits of some? What is the purpose of our government at this point? Is it there to take care of people, or is it there to take care of some people? What is the purpose of the design of our cities? Is it to make sure that everybody has a safe community to live in, or is it just to make money for some people? Right. So sit down and really think about, what do you think the purpose of the way that we've organized every bit of our culture is? And I think what you might find is that in a lot of cases, like, what we're doing with our systems and structures is churning out more violence, harm, and destruction, right? Because it's beneficial to some people who aren't experiencing the harm of those systems.
Mhm.
And so it really begs the question, if we want to live in a different kind of world, maybe we need to really rework the systems and structures that make up our day-to-day lives. And I think, for me, this is what I try to describe when I'm talking about a culture of peace and nonviolence, is that if we're going to spend every Friday and Saturday night watching violent movies, and 90% of all movies have an act of violence, small or extreme. If we're gonna spend so much time learning the ways of violence through our entertainment, through our media, if we're gonna hear all these violent stories, then we're just going to keep living the violent stories. If we want to live a different story, we need to connect with different stories. We need to recognize the nonviolent stories or the people who are working for peace in the context of their stories. And if those are in short supply, which I think you might find when you start looking, then we need to start making those stories, right? Instead of letting your kids spend hours each day playing violent war games where they're literally shooting people and chopping off people's heads, unplug them and sit them down and try to have them tell stories that are rooted in creative, nonviolent resolution of conflicts. Because conflict is inevitable. Humans are always going to run into conflict. The question is really, what are we going to do about it when we get to that point? Are we going to try to find a way to resolve that conflict? Or are we just going to try to bash the other person in to get our way? And, I say that a little tongue in cheek, but on an existential level, that is the question of our time, right? Are we going to continue to fund war and militarism so some people in our society can live nicer lives than others, right? Or are we going to say our duty, our responsibility, and our joy is anchored in taking care of one another? With all this mess of the climate crisis that we're facing, are we going to find meaning and purpose in actually taking care of people through the disasters that we're going through, right? Making sure everybody has food, water, and shelter, right? Making sure that people who have had to leave their homes can find new homes in other places, right? I find that these times are inviting us to a deeper, more meaningful sense of purpose. Yes. And it's not going to be anchored in fighting wars for our own dominance. It's going to be anchored in waging peace that's rooted in justice.
Right, and I think you made a couple good points in there. One, you were talking about our systems and how so many of them are set up to take care of the few instead of, the whole. But you're talking about, we have to want those systems to be different. We have to sit down and think about, well, those are pretty ingrained systems. And so it makes me think, how do we make, or how do we encourage, I guess I should say, how do we encourage people that really haven't been empathetic or compassionate towards others because, they do live a comfortable life. They're afraid to give any of that up, because they've been taught there's, only so much to go around. And so it's a fearful thing to think you might have to start spreading the abundance. I'm thinking, how do we do that? How do we, it's probably in them somewhere. They just haven't been in that zone to be connected to it. But that brings me back to, the stories we tell and where we put our focus. And so, Laurie, you deal with art to do some peace building. And I think as artists, that's a really good way to start creating empathy. You do it for your writing, through your writing, Rivera, and Laurie does it through art and working with, starting with children. And so, Laurie, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what Rivera was saying in regards to maybe through art creating change.
Without vision, the people perish. If we don't have a vision of a system that does work for all, it won't happen. Our country began with this vision of liberty and justice for all, ALL, and it was for white men with land. And we're getting closer and closer, right? We're moving in that direction of liberty and justice for all. And the work that I do is to make big collaborative murals that are a vision of many people working together so that you can just feel how exciting and beautiful it is for many people to work together. One of the reasons movies have so much power is that many people have worked together, only we use that power to tell stories of unwanted physical contact, which is a form of bullying. And um, so I think it's really important. I think that Paul Chappelle also explains something so important, which is that we don't have peace literacy skill training. And he says 1,000 years ago, we thought that we had to sacrifice people in order for the crops to grow, and nobody needed to know how to read. But now nobody thinks you have to sacrifice somebody to grow crops, and we assume that everybody needs to know how to read. And what's necessary next is the peace literacy skills, which is knowing how to experience your feelings and express them in a way that doesn't harm anyone else, knowing that it's very easy to trigger somebody else's feeling of unsafety, and that when you feel attacked, our reptile brain is going to attack back unless we interrupt it with 0.04 seconds worth of a breath. And getting trained in knowing that when your heart rate goes up to 176 beats per minute, you have tunnel vision, you cannot hear or see anything besides this, which is what happens to policemen when they feel attacked. Their heart rate goes crazy and they kill everything that moves, which is what dinosaurs do. And we need that training. We need the muscle of practice in active listening and recognizing mistreatment. Like Community Matters teaches kids how to recognize mistreatment, and they describe 5 of them: exclusion, put downs, intimidation, unwanted physical contact, and acts against the community. And they teach the kids how to distract a bully by changing the subject just with your friend, but move them away from somebody they're attacking, putting up a put down, giving support to somebody who's being excluded, getting help when you're overwhelmed. And those kinds of trainings can help. They can help bring the skill level up. And our politicians, they're all the time doing all those 5 forms of mistreatment.
I would also add, like, it scales, right? So it scales up from the schoolyard to our systems and institutions, to our politics, to our foreign policy, to the way that we as US citizens are behaving around the world. If we're going to talk about peace, we need to be realistic that we are the biggest exporter of war and violence around the world. Our military budget is bigger than the next 12 nations combined. We are actively at war in 9 places right now. Right. We have military bases in like 100 and I'm going to get the number wrong, but 120 plus countries around the world. We are a violent warmongering nation. And unless we say that, it's like the first step in admitting an addiction is to say that you have a problem, right? We tend to ignore all this. Our media doesn't report on it. It happens in a cloud of secrecy, more or less. People aren't paying attention to what our nation is doing, how it's behaving with the other nations around the world. And we have a lot of wreckage in our wake that we need to account for. And I would go so far as say make reparations for. Right now, the Afghan people are suffering severely because of our actions and decisions around the wars that we have waged in Afghanistan and our unwillingness to free up the money that rightfully should be going to them to help them with civilian relief. People are starving to death. People are freezing to death. These are the consequences of war. And I feel like in this country, we do this dance where we don't really understand war, right? We're addicted to violence in our movies and our television and our video games. We think we know all about war, but we don't really pay attention to the extreme suffering and grotesqueness that is war. And I think we need to be honest about it and talk about it. And for me, that's part of the cultural shift, is you need to be realistic about what this is. And you need to see the horror of what it is. And then you need to run in the other direction and say, what is the solution here? If that's the wrong way to go, what is the solution? And really look at the stories of waging peace that are out there. How did the women of Liberia stop the Second Liberian Civil War? How did the Kiwi soldiers help Bougainville actually maintain their peace accords? How did these amazing case studies from around the world actually secure peace, stop wars, and help us resolve our longstanding conflicts? Because these stories exist, and we should know them. We should be able to quote them. We should be seeing them on the cinema screen. We should be reading about them in books and novels. We should be seeing the tactics and the approaches woven into every aspect of our culture, until the smallest school child, when you ask them, how do you stop a war? They have an answer like that. Right? When you ask them, what are the tools of peace? They can rattle off 50 of them instead of being able to rattle off what are weapons, right?
Yeah.
This is what we mean by a culture of violence versus a culture of nonviolence, or a culture of war versus a culture of peace. And I agree with Laurie that art can play a tremendous role in showing people, giving people space to express that vision, hear everybody else's vision, recognize that it's not strange or unnatural to hate violence and long for peace and nonviolence. It's very normal for human beings.
Yeah, very well said, and so important. I do have a comment I want to read before we go any further. It's from Lydia, and she says, such an important conversation. Thank you for the invitation to explore the idea of cultivating our purpose through peace and nonviolence. Um,
And Lydia is a trainer for Community Matters, and she's also being trained in the Singing Tree Mural project, doing collaborative art as a peace building through art program inspired by nature. So hello, Lydia. Thank you for watching.
Yeah, thank you, Lydia, and so great on what you're undertaking at this time. So important.
Yes, she was actually she trained me to be
really?
for Community Matters. So we exchanged training. And I wanted to add something else about what you were saying, Rivera, about these peace building skills and being able to rattle off something, what the tools are. And one reality is that when you have a conflict between two people and they each listen to each other, something new is created, which is an understanding. And when you do art, you take two different materials like scissors and paper, and you create something, and something new emerges out of it. And that's a parallel between peace building and learning through conflict and making art. You never make art with just one point of view, with just one material. It's always like your hand and paper. There's always two things coming together. And when there's two viewpoints that are conflicting, they can create a new understanding that's so precious that neither party had before.
That's really a beautiful thought. I was thinking, I'm always, coming from the perspective of a writer and voice. And so some of what Rivera was just talking about, I think allowing new voices into the fold, for a long time, certain voices, even in the literary field, and in theater, in movie, certain people were kept out of that. Their stories were kept out. And so I think it's important to allow, those stories. I know when I'm reading about history, my favorite thing is to find journals. And because journals were often written by the people that weren't the ones you heard about, in the history books. And so I really think voice and then also language, and we may have talked about this, Rivera, in our previous conversation, but the words that we use, and I think you and I did as well, Laurie, we have war words and violent words that are being used all the time. I always keep my eyes open on advertising, and a few years back when I was on the college campus, just seeing messaging and there was still messaging, about like competition, and in business, the war words are used a lot. What's in your arsenal, and war games. They often talk about war games when they're talking about one business doing better than others. And, nice girls don't get the corner office. Those seem like such old time things to me, and yet I still see them circulating. And so I think that the words that we use have energy, and they affect us in ways we just get so used to it. We don't stop and think about it. We just use those words because those sayings are common and everybody knows what they mean. But I was just thinking about the word supreme recently, in relation to the happened to be something to do with the Supreme Court. But I was thinking, what a weird word to put on an organization, because, I was thinking supreme, supremacist, like it just, I felt really uncomfortable with that wording. And so I think that went back to what Rivera was saying earlier, like we need to sit down and start thinking, it doesn't mean certain things shouldn't exist, but how should we think of them, and what language should we use to describe them? And I'm just wondering if you tend to think that way, or, is it only me nitpicking down to the words? But, if either one of you have anything to say about that. And Rivera, I imagine you do, because you write.
Yeah, I do pay attention to it. I tend to pay attention less to the words that people are using, because I understand that, like, if we live in a culture of war and violence, they are common metaphors. We understand them to a certain degree, and we use them to invoke certain qualities in ourselves, qualities that maybe we agree are good, like courage and perseverance, determination. Mm-hmm. But the thing is that those qualities belonged to humanity before war existed. War has only been around since about 10,000 BC. That's the earliest archaeological evidence of an act of organized violence.
Wow.
Humanity has been around as Homo sapiens for about 200,000 years. And you can bet your boots that we were telling stories about all kinds of other things before then.
Shoot.
Things that, here are things that pre-existed war. Boats, dancing, singing, dogs. Dogs way predate war. Midwives, right? The list goes on. But when you really think about it, like the adventure, the sense of heroism, the sense of courage under difficult circumstances, all of that comes before war. So I think, I wasn't there, so I can't say this for definite, but I think war co-opted our values and made it sound like heroism meant going to war, right? And I think we're at a turning point in human history where we need to take those values back and say, in this day and age, it no longer is a direct equation, right? Heroes can be found in protest movements for rights and social change. Courage can be shown by mothers showing up to say, you can't evict our children. Perseverance can be shown by the youth standing up over and over and over again, saying to adults, you need to get your act together on the climate crisis, right? Yeah. These are our values as humanity. And for me, one of the things I think about besides the words is the deeper underlying story that we're telling. Are we saying might makes what right? Are we saying that survival of the fittest is what makes is the best, right? Or are we telling a different story that is also true about humanity, that cooperation and collaboration got us to where we are today, right? Yep. If we weren't overwhelmingly nonviolent, then we wouldn't be here, right? If we were just violent creatures, if that was our nature, then we would have long since killed ourselves off. So we know, therefore, that nonviolence is actually our human nature, right? So why aren't we telling that story? Why isn't that on our advertisements? So these are the things I stay up at night thinking about before I meditate and get inner peace.
Very well said. And Laurie, I was wondering if before we leave, you can talk a little bit about Now I forget what I was going to ask you as we were talking.
I'd like to share something that that relates to what Rivera said about peace heroes. We, as part of our International Day of Peace celebration, we invited a class, several classes in a school in El Paso to write about who their peace hero is. And we're going to award one of them with a publication in El Paso Matters newspaper. And they're so amazing, we're going to make a book out of them. So we've gotten like 85 stories about who my peace hero is. And we added who is your peace hero and how do they do conflict well? I heard this definition that peace is doing conflict well. And not only did I get a window into the extreme love and care between these young, they're all women, these young women and their grandfathers, their grandmothers, their little sisters, their mothers, who just act with this daily discipline of love and care. But I also realized that when I thought of peace as conflict done well, I always thought of it doing it in the moment. Like, okay, there's a conflict and I handled it really well. But what I got from these young women's stories is that it's over time. Keep working at it. Keep coming back to it. That conflict being done well means that you don't give up, that you keep the faith that there's something good that can come from your connection. And I just love these stories, and we're all of us on this planning committee are reading them, and we're just so moved by what they're writing about Helen Keller, Eleanor Roosevelt, Stevie Nicks, Dolly Parton, and Grandpa and Grandma, and my little sister, who always gives me the last piece of food on her plate. You know, just so there is this
Those
incredible
are nice stories.
And if we give attention to the behavior we want, that's sound dog training, it's sound parenting, and it's sound shaping of a peaceful culture.
Yeah, I really like that idea of putting our attention more on what we want to see and less on what we don't want to see. And actually, longevity was the question that was in my mind that I couldn't get to. So you addressed that. Anyway, it will be time to wrap up. Before we do, I want to give each of you a chance if you want to say something before we do. And I want to mention that next week, Grandmother Spider is back for the fall equinox. And so that will be another important topic. So, Rivera, if you want to just finish by saying anything, if you have anything else to add.
Sure. I would just say that on this year's International Day of Peace, which is September 21st, it's a great time to reaffirm your innate longing for peace, to speak up publicly about it, to start to articulate your views on what peace is, to be bold and unashamed, to say that peace is a worthy goal for humanity, and that it is time that we turned a corner on how we're handling conflicts in our world. We have the skills and the tools, we have the stories and examples, we have the burning longing in our hearts for it. So please reaffirm your commitment to peace this year and keep doing it throughout the year. Thank you.
And Laurie?
I'd like to share Elizabeth Sartorius, the evolutionary biologist's picture that human beings are leaving the caterpillar stage, and caterpillars devour their environment, destroy it basically, and that we're in a chrysalis right now where things are gooey and dissolving and messy, and that imaginal cells are finding each other. That's those of us who believe that peace is possible, and that a butterfly is going to emerge, which is the human consciousness that all living beings are sacred. And we're in the darkness of the womb, not the darkness of the tomb, as Valerie Carr says. And we can make a world that works for all. We know it's possible.
Very well said. And I want to thank you both for being on the show. I think this is such an important topic, and the more we can get talking about it, it does put our focus on it. So that's a really important thing to do. Um, and so I hope that you will come back again and we can talk about peace some more.
Yeah.
Future date. I'm sure it will be needed, still needed. So I want to thank you, Rivera, and thank you, Laurie, and welcome you back to the show anytime that you'd like to come on and share your news with us. And I want to thank everyone who listened in now and who will listen in later. Please leave your comments. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.